The silence in Aurelia was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating, woven from the scent of seared scallops and old money. You could hear the nervous flutter of a napkin, the faint clink of a distant ice cube. Alistair Finch, the reluctant king of a financial empire he never asked for, had just made the most preposterous wager of his life. He aimed a perfectly manicured finger, the cufflink a glint of old silver, at the waitress who stood frozen in a puddle of spilled Dom Perignon. "You wish for me to overlook this catastrophe," he drawled, his voice a low baritone that cut through the tension. His fiancée, Victoria Sterling, smirked beside him, a perfectly sculpted statue of contempt. "Very well. There is a piece of music on the piano over there, an obscure little thing. Sing it. Sing it with an ounce of genuine feeling, and I will not only forgive your clumsiness, I will call off my engagement to Miss Sterling and offer you a marriage contract on the spot." A wave of cruel, knowing laughter rippled through the dining room. They were sharks smelling blood, the city's elite eager for a spectacle. They expected the girl to dissolve into tears, to flee in humiliation. But they didn't know Clara Vance. They saw a cheap, ill-fitting uniform and a stain spreading across a worn apron. They didn't see the fire banked behind her eyes, the legacy of music that flowed through her veins like a tragic, beautiful poison. They had no idea that the young woman they were about to discard was going to open her mouth and resurrect a ghost, shattering the most powerful man in the city in the process. Aurelia wasn't a restaurant, it was a stage. Every night, a play of power and influence was performed upon its marble floors. Chandeliers like constellations of captured starlight hung from the frescoed ceiling, casting a cold, unforgiving light on the hedge fund managers, the shipping tycoons, and the political brokers who treated the world as their personal chessboard. Clara Vance was a stagehand in this theatre, meant to be invisible. Her job was to move through the shadows, a silent ghost refilling glasses of water that cost more than her weekly groceries, clearing plates laden with the remnants of exorbitant feasts, and absorbing the casual, thoughtless cruelty of the city's ruling class. The fabric of her black uniform was stiff, a constant, abrasive reminder of her place in this gilded world. She adjusted the collar, the motion automatic, her focus entirely on the table at the center of the room, the table that was its own gravitational force, Alistair Finch's table. "Alistair, are you even listening?" Victoria Sterling's voice was sharp, a sliver of ice in the warm room. She tapped a blood-red nail against the crisp linen tablecloth. "I said the curator for the Foundation's new wing is utterly pedestrian. He has the artistic sensibilities of a turnip. It reflects poorly on the Sterling name." Alistair Finch, his dark hair falling across a brow furrowed with a boredom so profound it was almost an art form, finally looked up from his phone. At 34, he possessed the kind of weary, classical handsome looks that belonged to a bygone era. He was the reluctant head of Finch Consolidated, a sprawling empire of shipping, real estate, and finance built by his grandfather. He moved markets with a sigh, but tonight he looked as if he would rather be auditing tax returns than enduring this dinner. "Victoria, it's a museum wing, not a coronation," he said, his voice laced with an exhaustion she chose to ignore. "No one is going to notice the curator's sensibilities when they're drunk on free champagne." "I will notice," Victoria countered, her voice dropping to a hiss. "And your grandmother will notice. It's about maintaining standards." Clara approached their table with a fresh bottle of champagne, her hands steady as a surgeon's. They always were. It was a discipline born of necessity. But inside, her heart beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. To be this close to Alistair Finch was to be near a kind of quiet storm. It wasn't just his wealth, it was the unnerving intelligence in his grey eyes, the sense that he saw every crack in the facade, including his own. As Clara leaned in to pour, a busboy, young and clumsy, darted from the kitchen, bumping her arm with force. It was a small, insignificant accident that unravelled the universe. The bottle tilted, a graceful, horrifying arc of pale gold liquid soaring through the air. It landed not on Victoria's dress, but directly on a stack of architectural blueprints Alistair had laid beside his plate. The champagne soaked the delicate paper, the ink of the intricate designs bleeding into a blurry, expensive mess. The silence that followed was absolute. "You incompetent fool!" Victoria shrieked, her voice cracking the stillness. She leaped to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "Do you know what that is? That is the final draft for the new children's hospital wing. It's ruined!" Clara felt the blood drain from her face. I am so deeply sorry, Miss Sterling, Mr. Finch. I was pushed. I don't care about your pathetic excuses." Victoria snatched a napkin and dabbed uselessly at the soaking papers, making the ink bleed further. Her rage, finding no purchase on the ruined plans, turned its full, venomous force on Clara. "Manager! Where is the manager? I want this clumsy idiot fired. I want her blacklisted. She will never work in this city again." Mr. Dubois, the floor manager, appeared as if summoned by dark magic, his face slick with sweat. "Miss Sterling, Mr. Finch, my sincerest apologies. Clara, go to the kitchen. You are finished here." "Wait." The single word was not loud, but it possessed an undeniable gravity. Alistair Finch had not moved from his seat. He calmly picked up a ruined sheet, holding it up to the light, a faint, unreadable expression on his face. "Alistair, don't you dare!" Victoria snapped. "She destroyed months of work." "It was an accident, Victoria," Alistair said, his voice dangerously calm. "And frankly, the design was uninspired. The champagne gives it a certain abstract quality. An improvement, I think." A choked laugh came from a nearby table. Victoria's face flushed a shade of crimson that clashed with her nails. "You're defending the help over me." It was then that Alistair looked at Clara, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw the frayed collar of her uniform, the exhaustion etched around her soft brown eyes, the stray strands of chestnut hair escaping her severe bun. But he also saw something else. She was not crying. She was standing perfectly still, her spine straight, her jaw set. She was terrified, yes, but she was not broken. It was a dissonance that piqued his cynical curiosity. "I'm merely suggesting," Alistair drawled, leaning back in his chair, "that firing her is a predictable and therefore boring solution. We are meant to be celebrating our impending merger. I mean, engagement. Let's have a bit of sport." "Sport?" Clara whispered, the word a ghost on her lips. Alistair stood, his tall frame unfolding from the chair. He walked over to the grand piano that sat on a small, raised dais where a jazz trio had been playing earlier. On the music stand, a piece of sheet music lay open, left behind by the pianist. It was not a popular tune. It was a complex, melancholic piece, full of discordant harmonies and a heart-breakingly beautiful melody. Alistair picked it up. He glanced at Victoria, a cruel glint in his eye. He was tired of her family's social climbing, of her manufactured passion for an art world she only understood in terms of auction prices. He wanted to expose the hollowness of it all. "Tell you what," Alistair announced, his voice carrying across the now silent restaurant. "Victoria claims to be a great patron of the arts, a connoisseur of talent. She says you have none. that you are merely a clumsy vessel for spilling expensive things. But I have a theory that true talent can be found in the most unlikely of places." He walked back to Clara, the sheet music held between 2 fingers. He didn't shove it at her. He offered it. "Sing this," he said, the dark sarcasm in his tone, a velvet glove over a fist of iron. "It's called Elegy for a Sparrow, by Arthur Vance, a composer no one has ever heard of. If you can sing this, and I mean truly sing it, not just bleat out the notes, I will not only ensure you keep your job, I will personally pay for the damages." He paused, a wicked smile playing on his lips as he saw the shock on the faces around him. He decided to elevate the absurdity, to mock the very foundation of his life. "In fact," Alistair declared, his voice ringing with theatrical finality, "if you can sing this forgotten little song with a single shred of real emotion, I will call off my engagement and offer you a marriage contract instead." The collective gasp of the room was a wind that could have extinguished a candle. Victoria's mouth fell open in disbelief. "Alistair, that is not amusing." "I am perfectly serious," Alistair lied, his grey eyes locking onto Clara's. "Go on, waitress. Sing for your supper. Sing for your dignity." It was a monstrous joke, a billionaire's cruel game to humiliate his fiancée and the collateral damage standing before him. Everyone waited for Clara to shatter. They waited for the tears, for the panicked flight to the kitchen. But Clara was not looking at them. She was looking at the sheet music. The notes, like familiar friends, swam into focus. Elegy for a Sparrow. Arthur Vance, her father. She knew this song. She knew it better than her own heartbeat. It was the last piece he had ever written, a lament for a bird with a broken wing he had found in their tiny garden, a lament for his own broken dreams. Clara looked up. She didn't look at Victoria's sneer or the crowd's morbid curiosity. She looked directly into the cynical, tired eyes of Alistair Finch. "Does your pianist know how to play with rubato?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear as a bell. Alistair's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "What?" "Tempo rubato," Clara repeated, her voice gaining a strange, resonant timbre. "The stolen time. Can he follow the singer's heart, or only the metronome?" The atmosphere in Aurelia shifted. The silence of second-hand embarrassment curdled into the silence of utter confusion. Alistair blinked. He had anticipated pleas, apologies, perhaps even a defiant curse. He had not anticipated a question about 19th-century romantic musical interpretation. "He was trained at Juilliard," Alistair replied slowly, his curiosity now a roaring fire. He gestured to the pianist, a man in his 60s who had been watching the scene with a pained expression. "I imagine he can keep up." Clara nodded once. She walked toward the small stage. Her cheap, sensible shoes made a soft, solitary sound on the polished marble, a sound of quiet defiance. "Don't do this, Clara," a voice screamed inside her head. "You promised. You buried that part of yourself for a reason. Music brings nothing but pain. You are Clara Vance, the waitress. You are not her daughter anymore." But the humiliation was a burning coal in her chest, the way Victoria had looked through her as if she were less than human. The casual cruelty of Alistair's game. It woke a part of her she thought had died with her father, the part that refused to be silent. She reached the piano. Mr. Henderson, the pianist, looked at her with deep pity. "My dear," he whispered, "you don't have to do this. It's a cruel joke." "The introduction is 8 bars, Clara said, her hand resting on the glossy black lid of the piano. It was not shaking. "Start softly. And please don't rush the fermata in the 12th measure. My father was very specific about that." Mr. Henderson's eyes widened. He looked from the girl's impossibly calm face to Alistair, who gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The pianist placed his fingers on the keys. The opening chords of the elegy trickled into the room, delicate and sorrowful, like raindrops on a window pane. Victoria crossed her arms, a smug look of anticipation on her face, ready for the inevitable failure. Alistair leaned against a marble pillar, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, waiting for his point to be made so he could finally go home. Clara closed her eyes. She did not take a dramatic, theatrical breath. She simply let the air fill her lungs, and then she began to sing. The voice that emerged was not the one the room expected. It was not loud or ostentatious. It was a thread of sound, so pure and heartbreakingly fragile it seemed to hang in the air like smoke. It was a mezzo-soprano of shocking richness and warmth, a voice that sounded like aged velvet and unshed tears. Her German was perfect, the consonants soft, the vowels pure. But it was the emotion that stilled the room. She was not performing. She was mourning. She poured every ounce of her grief for her father, his poverty, his genius, his quiet death, into the melody. She sang of the small, broken bird, but everyone in the room heard the story of a broken human heart. Alistair Finch's glass stopped midway to his lips. The cynical smirk dissolved from his face, replaced by an expression of stunned disbelief. This was not the thin, reedy voice of an amateur. This was a voice that had been trained, polished, and then steeped in genuine sorrow. It was a voice that knew things. The melody swelled, the emotional core of the piece. Clara's voice rose with it, no longer fragile, but filled with a soaring, desperate power that seemed to press against the very walls of the restaurant. Her posture had changed. She stood taller, her hands no longer clasped nervously, but moving with unconscious grace, painting the story in the air. The guests had put down their forks. The waiters had stopped in their tracks. The entire world of Aurelia had ceased to turn. Then came the song's most difficult passage, a quiet, descending scale meant to mimic the fading life of the sparrow, a passage that required flawless breath control. Clara navigated it, not with technical perfection, but with devastating emotional honesty. Each note was a step closer to goodbye. Alistair felt a cold dread mix with a strange, unfamiliar awe. He had grown up surrounded by the arts, dragged to operas and symphonies by his grandmother. He knew the difference between technique and soul. This was pure, unvarnished soul. This was impossible. He looked at the woman he had so casually baited. The worn-out shoes, the cheap uniform, the tired eyes, they all seemed to melt away, replaced by a luminous, tragic beauty. Victoria Sterling had gone ghost white. The smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of horrified recognition. She was not looking at a clumsy waitress. She was looking at a genuine artist, and in her world, that was a threat. Clara sang the final note, holding it with a delicate, fading strength until it was nothing more than a whisper of air, leaving behind a silence more profound than any that had come before. She held the silence for a long, aching moment, then opened her eyes. The spell was broken. The reality of what she had done, of who she had revealed, crashed down upon her. She looked at Alistair Finch. He was no longer leaning against the pillar. He was standing straight, his glass forgotten on a nearby table. He was staring at her with an intensity that felt like a physical touch, his grey eyes burning with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else entirely. Something that looked unnervingly like hunger. Slowly, deliberately, Alistair Finch began to clap. His applause was the only sound in the cavernous room, a slow, rhythmic, resonant sound. Then, An elderly woman at a corner table, tears streaming down her face, joined in. Then the entire room erupted. It was not polite applause. It was a roar of approval, a standing ovation for the waitress in the stained apron. The city's elite, for one brief, shining moment, forgot who she was and remembered only what she had made them feel. Victoria stood frozen, her face a mask of incandescent rage. She grabbed Alistair's arm. "Stop it! Stop clapping for her! It was a trick!" Alistair shook her hand off without a glance. He started walking toward the stage, his movements slow, deliberate, like a man in a trance. Clara saw him coming. The adrenaline that had fueled her song turned to ice-cold panic. He knows, or he will find out. You have to run. "Who are you?" Alistair asked, as he reached the edge of the stage. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual ironic detachment. That wasn't a waitress singing that song. "Who are you?" Clara backed away, her hands clutching her apron like a shield. I have to get back to my station." "The wager stands," Alistair said, stepping onto the stage. He was only inches from her now. She could smell the faint scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp scent of bergamot and cedar. "I made a promise." The crowd quieted, leaning in, desperate for the next act of the drama. Clara looked into his piercing grey eyes. "And everyone in this room knows, Mr. Finch, that men like you make promises as easily as they break them." With that, she turned and fled. She didn't walk. She ran, off the stage, through the swinging service doors, and into the chaotic, steamy sanctuary of the kitchen, leaving Alistair Finch standing alone in the spotlight, looking at the empty space where she had been, looking more utterly, dangerously alive than he had in years. "Find her," Alistair said, his voice a low command to the head of his security detail, a man named Graves who had materialized at his side. "I don't care what it takes. Find out everything there is to know about her, and bring her to my office tomorrow morning." Clara Vance ran until the glittering spires of Midtown were replaced by the squat, weary brick tenements of the Lower East Side. Her lungs burned, each breath a searing reminder of her foolishness. She fumbled with the keys to her fourth-floor walk-up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely fit the key in the lock. Finally, the door creaked open. She slammed it shut behind her, leaning against the wood, sliding down to the cracked linoleum floor. The cool surface did nothing to quell the fire of panic racing through her. She had sung her father's song. After 5 years of silence, 5 years of burying Clara Vance, the composer's daughter, the girl who lived and breathed music, she had resurrected her in front of New York's high society. And worse, she had done it for Alistair Finch. "Clara, is that you, honey?" A frail voice, thin as parchment, called from the other room. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, forcing the panic down. She pushed herself up, smoothed her stained apron, and walked into the small, cluttered bedroom. Her mother, Eleanor, lay propped against a mountain of pillows, an oxygen tube clipped to her nose. The room smelled of rubbing alcohol and fading roses. "Hey, Mama," Clara whispered, forcing a smile that felt like cracking glass. "I'm home." "You're early," Eleanor said, her breathing shallow. "Did that awful Mr. Dubois let you go?" "Something like that," Clara lied, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her mother's cool, dry hand. I quit." Eleanor's tired eyes widened with fear. "Clara, the rent, my medications." "I'll find something else tomorrow," she promised, her voice fierce. "A double shift somewhere else. I'll make it work. Don't you worry about a thing." She was lying, and they both knew it. Her mother's emphysema was getting worse. The medical bills were a mountain, and she was trying to climb it with a teaspoon. Her mother studied her face, her gaze preternaturally sharp. "You look different. There's music in your eyes again, the way they used to look when your father was at the piano." Clara looked away, toward the small, framed photo on the nightstand. A smiling, bright-eyed man with a shock of unruly hair. Arthur Vance, the unrecognized genius who had died of a heart attack at 45, leaving behind a stack of brilliant compositions and a mountain of debt. After his death, Clara had vowed to leave that world behind. The world of auditions, rejections, and condescending patrons had broken her father's heart. She wouldn't let it break hers. Singing was dangerous. Singing was hope, and hope was a luxury she could not afford. "Go to sleep, Mama," she said softly, kissing her mother's forehead. "I just need to think." Across town, in a penthouse that floated above the city like a ship of glass and steel, the atmosphere was considerably more charged. Alistair Finch stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, a tumbler of Macallan 25 in his hand, watching the river of headlights below. "The file, sir," Graves said, placing a thin manila folder on a vast obsidian desk. Alistair turned. "That was quick." "She wasn't trying to hide," Graves replied. "Clara Vance, age 25, no current address on file before this one, lives with her mother, Eleanor Vance, who is suffering from late-stage chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. The medical debt is significant." Alistair picked up the file. He flipped it open. "What else?" "Here's the interesting part," Graves said, tapping a section of the report. "Her father was Arthur Vance." The name hung in the air. "The composer," Alistair murmured, remembering the sheet music. "The one no one's ever heard of." He was a scholarship student at Juilliard in his youth, a contemporary of some of the biggest names in modern classical music, but he refused to compromise his style. He wouldn't play the game, as they say. He died penniless 5 years ago. Clara was his only child. She takes care of her mother by working 2 full-time waitressing jobs. A cold, unfamiliar emotion coiled in Alistair's gut. It wasn't pity, it was a kind of furious respect. He looked at the photograph Graves had included in the file, a candid shot of Clara on the street, her face weary but determined. He thought of her voice, filled with a sorrow so profound it had silenced a room of jaded millionaires. It wasn't just a performance, it was her life, and he had turned it into a cruel parlor game. He looked at the diamond engagement ring Victoria had hurled at him in the limo on the way home. He'd calmly picked it up and put it in his pocket. The engagement was a business arrangement, a strategic merger of the Finch and Sterling empires, demanded by his board of directors to present a stable front to the market. They wanted a Finch wife. The contract didn't specify it had to be Victoria Sterling. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan that was reckless, audacious, and utterly, magnificently insane. "Graves," Alistair said, his voice taking on a new, decisive edge. "Prepare the car." "Sir, it's nearly 2 a.m. "I'm aware," Alistair said, shrugging on his suit jacket. "We're going to the Lower East Side." The knock on the door was sharp and authoritative. It was not the knock of the landlord or a neighbor. It was the knock of someone who was accustomed to doors opening for them. Clara, who had been staring at a stack of unpaid bills at her tiny kitchen table, grabbed the heaviest cast-iron skillet she owned and crept to the door. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. "Alistair Finch." The name was a physical blow. She staggered back, the skillet feeling suddenly useless. "Go away." "Miss Vance, I assure you I'm not here to complain about the service." His voice came through the thin wood, calm and resonant. "We need to discuss the terms of my offer. Open the door, Or I can have this conversation with your neighbors in the hallway. I'm sure they'd be interested." Clara's heart hammered. She thought of her mother sleeping in the next room. Cursing herself, she unbolted the locks and opened the door just wide enough to see him. He stood in the dim, peeling hallway, looking utterly alien in his bespoke suit, his presence sucking all the air out of the cramped space. "May I come in?" "No." "Very well," he said, not missing a beat. He leaned against the doorframe. "I have your mother's complete medical file. I know that her current treatment plan is palliative at best. I also know there's an experimental therapy being trialed at a private clinic in Switzerland that has shown remarkable results. It is, of course, prohibitively expensive." Clara's grip on the doorknob faltered. "What do you want from me?" "I want to come inside so we can discuss it." She pulled the door open. He stepped into the tiny, cluttered living room, his eyes taking in everything. The threadbare rug, the second-hand furniture, the faint smell of sickness and desperation. He did not look disgusted. He looked observant. "You had your fun tonight," Clara said, crossing her arms over her chest. "You humiliated your fiancé and got a free show. Now leave me and my family alone." "She is no longer my fiancé," Alistair said calmly. "I ended our arrangement an hour ago." Clara blinked. "Congratulations. That has nothing to do with me." "On the contrary," he said, "it has everything to do with you." He began to pace, his expensive shoes silent on the linoleum. "I have a problem, Miss Vance. My position as CEO of Finch Consolidated is conditional. My grandfather's will stipulates that I must be married by my 35th birthday to assume full, unconditional control of the company. That birthday is in 6 weeks. "Sounds like a terrible burden," Clara said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "It is, when the board is trying to force a merger with Sterling Industries and is using this clause as leverage," he countered, stopping to face her. "They wanted me to marry Victoria. I find that I can no longer tolerate the idea." He paused, his grey eyes intense. "I made a public spectacle tonight. A joke. I said if you could sing, I would offer you a marriage contract." Clara let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You can't be serious. You're insane." "I am a businessman, Miss Vance. I honor my agreements, especially the ones made in front of 200 of the most influential people in New York." He stepped closer. "I need a wife for 1 year. Someone intelligent, poised, and utterly unimpressed by the world I live in. Someone who has every reason to despise the Sterling family. After a year, we quietly divorce. I retain control of my company. You walk away with a settlement that would ensure your mother receives the best medical care in the world for the rest of her life." "I am not for sale," Clara spat, though the word Switzerland was echoing in her mind. "Everything is for sale," Alistair said, his voice devoid of malice, a simple statement of fact. "It's just a matter of finding the right currency." He didn't pull out a checkbook. He simply looked at her. "I heard your father in your voice tonight. I heard his genius, his tragedy. Victoria and her family represent the system that crushed him. This isn't just about money for your mother. This is about justice. Help me dismantle their influence, and in the process, I will help you save the one person you have left." It was a devil's bargain. She knew that. He was a cold, calculating man, using her desperation as a tool. But he was also the first person to ever mention her father with something other than pity. He had heard the genius. She thought of her mother's labored breathing in the next room. She thought of the 5 years she had spent silencing the most vital part of herself. "What are the terms?" she whispered, hating the weakness in her own voice. Alistair did not smile in triumph. He nodded, as if closing a deal. We sign a comprehensive prenuptial agreement. We marry quietly at City Hall this week. We present a united front to my board, my family, and the public. You will live in my home. You will attend functions. You will play the part of the woman who inexplicably captured the heart of New York's most cynical bachelor. And the singing? Clara asked, the question hanging in the air. Alistair hesitated, his expression unreadable. That is entirely up to you. The world deserves to hear that voice. Miss Vance. But my contract does not require it. Clara took a shaky breath. She looked at this impossible man who had offered her both ruin and salvation in the same night. I want it in writing, she said, her voice hardening. The clinic in Switzerland, a trust fund for my mother's lifelong care, untouchable by you or anyone else, and a clause stipulating separate wings of the house. This is a business arrangement, Mr. Finch. Nothing more. A flicker of something, amusement, respect, lit up his eyes. Of course. My lawyer is waiting downstairs with a preliminary draft. Clara glanced toward her mother's bedroom door, then back at him. I'll need a few hours. Take all the time you need, Alistair said, turning for the door. Welcome to the firm, future Mrs. Finch. The following weeks were a dizzying, surreal blur. Clara's mother was flown by private medical jet to the clinic in Switzerland, her eyes wide with a hope Clara hadn't seen in years. The City Hall ceremony was a sterile 10-minute affair with Graves and Alistair's lawyer as witnesses. Then Clara moved into the penthouse, a silent, minimalist palace in the sky that felt more like a museum than a home. Her wing was separated from his by a long, art-filled corridor. It was a cold, lonely existence, punctuated by grueling sessions with tutors on etiquette, finance, and the complex genealogies of New York's old money families. The first true test came in the form of Eleanor Finch, Alistair's grandmother. The matriarch of the family, a woman whose disapproval could freeze the Hudson River. Dinner was a tense affair in the penthouse's formal dining room. Eleanor, draped in pearls and uncut diamonds, regarded Clara with the piercing gaze of a hawk studying a field mouse. So, Eleanor began, setting down her fork with a delicate click. You are the songbird from the gutter. I am, Clara replied, her voice steady. Alistair tells me you have spirit. I find spirit is often just another word for a lack of breeding, the old woman said, her eyes narrowed. Tell me, child, what do you know of value? What do you know of things that last? It was a test. Clara knew it. She wasn't asking about stocks or bonds. Clara looked not at the old woman, but at the magnificent mahogany sideboard that stood against the far wall. That sideboard, Clara said softly. It's a Goddard Townsend piece. Newport, circa 1760. The shell carvings are unmistakable. It's beautiful, but its real value isn't the auction price. It's the wood. Old-growth Cuban mahogany. They called it the wood that sings. The craftsman who made it believed that the soul of the tree lived on in the furniture, that it would resonate with the lives lived around it. She looked back at Eleanor Finch, whose perfectly composed face was now a mask of shock. My father taught me about wood before he taught me about music, Clara continued. He said that some things, wood, music, people, have a truth inside them that lasts longer than money or fame. That is what I know of value, Mrs. Finch. Silence descended on the table. Alistair stared at Clara, a look of profound astonishment on his face. Eleanor Finch slowly placed her napkin on the table. A small, dry smile touched her lips. Well, I'll be damned, she whispered. The girl has substance. Perhaps you haven't entirely lost your mind, after all, Alistair. The lines of their contract began to blur after that night. They fell into a routine. Late-night conversations over untouched glasses of wine in the vast living room. He would talk about the crushing weight of his legacy, she about the quiet dignity of her father. He discovered she had a mind as sharp as his own, a dry wit that could pierce his cynical armor. She discovered that beneath the ruthless businessman was a man who was profoundly lonely. The inevitable confrontation with Victoria Sterling came at the annual Conservatory Gala, the glittering heart of the city's cultural calendar. Victoria, seeing Clara in a simple but elegant sapphire gown at Alistair's side, saw her chance. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "If it isn't the little songbird, I hear you found a gilded cage. Tell me, is the seed and water to your liking?" "The view is certainly better than the one I had scrubbing your lipstick stains off champagne flutes," Clara replied, her voice calm. Victoria's face tightened. "You can put a canary in couture, but it still chirps the same cheap tune. Let's see if your benefactor has bought you any actual talent." She turned to the gala's organizer. "A surprise performance. Our little Cinderella will sing for us." The crowd murmured, a trap snapping shut. To refuse would be an admission of fear. To accept was to risk public failure. Alistair moved to intervene, his face thunderous, but Clara Plae hand, cool and steady, rested on his arm. "It's all right," she whispered, the words a quiet anchor in the swirling chaos. Alistair turned to her, a storm of protective fury in his eyes, ready to tear Victoria Sterling down from the stage. But the woman he saw beside him was not the terrified waitress from Aurelia. Her spine was a rod of steel, her eyes clear and calm. In them, he saw not fear, but a dispassionate, calculating focus that mirrored his own. She looked at Victoria, whose face was a mask of triumphant cruelty, and a slow, cold smile, sharp as a shard of ice, spread across her face. "I would be delighted," Clara said, her voice carrying a strange new resonance in the charged atmosphere. "But I will not be performing one of your tired, predictable arias. I will sing something new." She did not wait for permission. She moved toward the grand piano on the far side of the stage, her sapphire gown whispering against the floorboards. The pianist, a man she had met with only once, looked up at her, his expression a mixture of panic and pity. She leaned in, her voice too low for the microphones to catch. "Do you remember the piece we discussed? The one in C-sharp minor?" He nodded, his eyes widening in comprehension and a sudden, dawning respect. Clara turned to face the glittering assembly. The patrons, the critics, the investors. They were a sea of judgment, their faces illuminated by the cold, clinical lights of the ballroom. She felt the weight of their gaze, the collective hunger for her humiliation. But she was no longer the girl who flinched from such scrutiny. She was a vessel, and the music was about to pour through her. "This is a piece that has never been performed publicly," she announced, her voice amplified by the microphone, ringing with an authority that silenced the last of the murmurs. "It is an unfinished work, a fragment. It is called First Light. It was written by my father, Arthur Vance." She gave the pianist a single, sharp nod. The opening chords fell into the silence, not with the sorrow of the elegy she had sung at Aurelia, but with a sound that was hesitant, questioning, like the first tentative rays of sun probing a dark and sleeping world. It was a melody of profound vulnerability, of a hope that was not yet certain of its own existence. And then she sang. The voice that filled the grand ballroom was not the same one that had shattered the cynical calm of the restaurant. The grief was still there, a foundational bass note of sorrow that gave the sound its incredible depth. But it was no longer the dominant theme. This was something else. This was a voice that had passed through the crucible of grief and emerged on the other side, tempered and unbreakable. She sang of the fragile moment between the deepest dark and the dawn, of the promise of a new day that was not a guarantee, but a choice. It was a song of resilience, a testament to survival, a quiet, defiant declaration that to be broken is not to be defeated. Her voice soared through the complex, dissonant harmonies her father had favored, navigating the difficult intervals not with the detached perfection of a technician, but with the searing honesty of a survivor. She was not performing a song. She was testifying. She was telling them all, Victoria, the board, the world, that they could not break her, because she had already been broken and had put herself back together, piece by painstaking piece. When she reached the final, unresolved chord, she held it, letting the note hang in the air, a question mark of sound, before allowing it to fade into a silence more profound and complete than any applause. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The spell held them all captive. Then the silence was broken, not by a clap, but by a single, thunderous thud. It was Eleanor Finch, who had risen to her feet, her face a mask of awe. She struck the floor with the base of her ebony cane. Thud, thud, thud. It was a sound more powerful than any ovation, a primal, rhythmic beat of approval, of victory. Tears were streaming, unchecked, down her powdered cheeks, and then the room erupted. It was a tidal wave of sound, a roar of acclamation that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers, a standing ovation not for the CEO's wife, but for the artist who had just laid her soul bare upon the stage. Clara had not just won the moment. She had irrevocably changed the narrative. She was no longer the waitress from the gutter, the subject of a cruel wager. She was Arthur Vance's daughter, the heir to a legacy of genius and a formidable power in her own right. Later that night, long after the last of the reporters had been placated and the Sterling family had been quietly, ruthlessly dismantled in the back rooms of power, they stood on the penthouse balcony. The city sprawled beneath them, a silent, glittering tapestry of 1,000,000 lives, 1,000,000 stories. The air was cool against Clara's skin, a welcome balm after the heat of the battle. The silence between them was no longer the sterile, contractual silence of their early days, but a shared space of exhaustion, relief, and unspoken understanding. "You were magnificent," Alistair finally said, his voice rough, stripped of its usual layers of irony and control. He was not looking at the city, but at her profile, illuminated by the soft glow from the living room. "I have never seen anything like it." "She gave me no choice," Clara replied, her gaze fixed on a distant, blinking light. "It was the only move left on the board." "You always have a choice," he said, and she felt him step closer, the warmth of his body a tangible presence in the cool night air. "You could have let me handle it. You could have stayed silent. But tonight you chose to be yourself. Unconditionally." He was so close now that she could feel the faint tremor in his hand as he reached out, not to cup her cheek, but to gently take her hand in his. His fingers laced through hers, a simple, profound gesture of connection that felt more intimate than any kiss. "Clara," he began, his voice dropping to a murmur, "this contract, this entire arrangement we built as a fortress, it has become insufficient. It's a cage, and I just watched you fly. It's what we agreed to," she whispered, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. The paper, the clauses, the stipulations, they had been her shield. "To hell with what we agreed to," he murmured, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "The man who wrote that contract didn't know you. He was a cynic, a pragmatist. He accounted for every possible market fluctuation, every corporate contingency, but he didn't account for you. He didn't account for the sound of your voice, or the sharpness of your mind, or the way you look at a Goddard Townsend sideboard and see the soul of the tree. He didn't account for any of this. He used his other hand to gently turn her face toward him. In his eyes, she saw none of the ruthless CEO, none of the reluctant king. She saw only a man, vulnerable and exposed, looking at her as if she were the only solid thing in a world of shadows. He leaned in, and the universe narrowed to the space between their lips. The kiss, when it came, was not the fiery, desperate discovery of the night before the storm. This was something deeper, quieter. It was a kiss of homecoming. It spoke of battles won, of fears faced, of two profoundly lonely souls who had stumbled into a partnership and found a sanctuary. It was tender and searching and held a promise of a future that was not written on paper, but would be built, day by day, together. They stood there for a long time, foreheads resting against each other, the city breathing its silent rhythm below them, the chaos of the day finally receding into a shared peace. The shrill ring of Alistair's private phone was a violent intrusion, a relic from a world that no longer seemed to matter. He pulled back with a sigh of profound irritation, his eyes never leaving hers. Ignore it. It might be important, she breathed, though she wanted nothing more than to stay in that perfect, suspended moment forever. He glanced at the screen, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face before it softened. "It's Graves," he said, answering the call but keeping his gaze locked on her. "Yes?" He listened for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see. And the other matter?" Another pause. "Excellent. No, that won't be necessary. The situation has been resolved. Thank you, Graves." He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket. "What is it?" Clara asked, a faint echo of the previous night's dread tightening her stomach. Alistair shook his head, a slow, wry smile touching his lips. "It was just confirmation of what we already knew. Victoria's father has withdrawn their bid for the hostile takeover. The board is in full retreat. It seems leaking the details of the Sterling Foundation's embezzlement from their artists' grants to a few key financial journalists was persuasive." He paused, his smile fading into something more serious. "The other call was from my lawyer's office. They wanted me to know that Victoria broke in an hour before the gala. She stole the copy of our prenup." Clara stared at him, confused. "But—" "She had it at the meeting." "No," Alistair said softly. "She didn't. Graves anticipated she would make a move like that after I ended the engagement. He had the real document moved to a secure vault. The one in my lawyer's safe was a forgery." "A forgery?" "A very clever one," he admitted. "With a few enhancements. A clause, for instance, stipulating that if the contract were ever made public by a third party, a $50 million penalty would be paid directly from the Sterling family's personal accounts into a blind trust for the promotion of undiscovered musical artists." He watched her face as the implication sank in. Victoria played her hand, thinking she was holding the Queen of Hearts. She was holding a card that bankrupted her. Clara felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He had been playing chess while she had been preparing for a brawl. He had built a safety net for her, even as he prepared for the worst. "You didn't tell me." "It was a fail-safe," he said simply. "A last resort. I never wanted to use it. I wanted to stand beside you and fight, but I would be damned if I was going to let you face her fire without an escape route she couldn't see." He took a step back, creating a small space between them, a space for honesty. "But then you stood up, Clara. You walked to that podium, And you did something I never could have planned. You didn't use a fail-safe. You didn't need one. You used the truth. And you tore up $10 million as if it was scrap paper. He shook his head, a look of genuine wonder on his face. That was the moment. That was the moment I knew this wasn't about a contract, or a company, or a legacy. That was the moment I understood. Understood what? She whispered. That my entire life I've been bartering and negotiating for things of value. Companies, properties, alliances. All just paper. All just numbers on a screen. You stood on that stage and you showed them. You showed me what real value is. It's integrity. It's truth. It's the courage to stand in the wreckage of your life and build something new. He took her hands in his. I don't want to be your employer, Clara. I don't want to be your benefactor. I want to be your partner in everything. The cool, rational part of her mind, the part that had kept her safe for 5 long years, was screaming that this was impossible. A fairy tale spun from champagne and desperation. But her heart, the part of her that had been reawakened by her father's music, knew the truth. She saw it in his eyes. "The money," she said, her voice barely audible. It really meant nothing. After my father died, I spent 5 years equating value with survival. $1 was a meal. A paycheck was another week of my mother's oxygen. I thought that was the only truth. But when I was standing there, with everyone watching, I realized that the price of that contract was my silence, my story, and it was too high. I couldn't afford it. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. My grandmother is waiting inside. She wishes to speak with you. Alone. Clara felt a flicker of apprehension, but she nodded. She walked back into the vast living room, where Eleanor Finch sat in a high-backed chair, a figure of formidable stillness. She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit, child." Clara sat, her hands folded in her lap. "When my husband, Alistair's grandfather, built this empire," the old woman began, her voice dry as autumn leaves, "he did it with a ruthlessness that was both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness. He saw the world as a collection of assets to be acquired. He passed that view on to my son, and my son passed it on to Alistair. The Finch men are collectors of beautiful, valuable things." She leaned forward, her dark eyes piercing. "Tonight, I watched my grandson look at you, and for the first time, I did not see a collector admiring his latest acquisition. I saw a man who was terrified of losing something he knew he could never own and could never replace. You have done what no one else could. You have taught him the difference between price and worth." Eleanor reached out and placed a cool, wrinkled hand over Clara's. "This family does not need another ornament. It needs a new foundation. It needs a soul. I believe that soul is yours." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, blurring the image of the formidable matriarch. They were not tears of sadness or even relief, but of a deep, resonant belonging. Later, when Eleanor had retired and the penthouse had fallen into a deep and peaceful quiet, Clara found Alistair by the piano. He wasn't playing, just running his fingers silently over the keys. "She's setting up a foundation," he said, without turning around. "The Arthur Vance Foundation for New Musical Talent. She insists you run it. She said it's high time a Vance was in charge of their own legacy." Clara came to stand beside him, her reflection joining his on the polished black surface of the piano lid. "I'll do it," she said softly. "But not as a gift, and not alone. We'll do it together." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the future. "I believe I owe you a proper wedding, Mrs. Finch," he said. his voice soft with a smile. One without lawyers present, and then a very long honeymoon. Somewhere quiet, with no board members and no reporters. He paused, his hand covering hers on the silent keys. After that, what do you want to do? It was the most important question he had ever asked her. He wasn't telling her what he would give her. He was asking her what she wanted to build. She thought of her father, of his quiet genius and his broken heart. She thought of the music locked away in dusty boxes in her old apartment. She thought of the voice she had silenced for so long. "I want to find the rest of my father's music," she said, her voice filled with a new, quiet purpose. "I want to archive it, understand it, and then I want to sing it, not in a gala or a grand hall to prove a point, but in a small theatre for people who love music. I want to tell his story." "Then that's what we'll do," he said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. She looked down at their hands, intertwined on the piano keys. She had walked into Aurelia, a ghost, a silent waitress, hiding from a world that had taken everything from her. A single, impossible song had been the catalyst for a chain reaction she could never have imagined. It had not just won her a billionaire or saved her mother. It had forced her to confront her own silence. It had given her back her voice, and with it, the world. She pressed down on a single key, a clear, hopeful middle C that hung in the quiet room. Then she pressed another, and another, picking out a simple, unfamiliar melody. It was not an elegy of grief, nor a defiant anthem of survival. It was a new song, one she was composing in the moment, a melody of quiet, contented joy. Alistair watched her, his head tilted, a genuine, brilliant smile reaching his eyes as he listened to the sound of the music they would make together.